The Chicago skyline glittered outside the window, a cold masterpiece of steel and glass, much like the woman sitting across from him. He saw the way she hid her phone screen when it lit up, saw the disdain in her eyes as she looked at his calloused hands resting on the pristine tablecloth, and he realized that the sawdust on his clothes was no longer a sign of hard work to her. It was a stain she wanted to scrub away. If you've ever felt the sting of being undervalued by the one person who was supposed to believe in you and want to see the moment the tables finally turn, stick around, because the payout is coming. Underscore. The waiter at Alinea looked at Thomas's hands as he placed the menu down. It was a subtle glance, lasting less than a second, but Thomas caught it. He always caught it. His knuckles were swollen from a hammer slip 2 days ago, and despite scrubbing them with pumice stone and industrial soap until they were raw, a faint line of walnut stain remained etched into his cuticles. To the waiter, they were dirty hands. To Thomas, they were evidence of the 12-hour days he'd spent finishing the prototype that would change his life. "You're doing it again," Laura said. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the ambient hum of hushed conversations and clinking silverware. Thomas looked up. Laura was glowing in the candlelight, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe, sleek bun. She wore a dress that cost more than his first truck. She wasn't looking at his face. She was looking at his hands resting on the white linen. "Doing what?" Thomas asked, his voice rough and deep, a contrast to the polished atmosphere. "Hiding your hands," she whispered, leaning in. "Or displaying them. I don't know. Just put them in your lap, Thomas. Please. It's my birthday." Thomas slowly withdrew his hands, placing them on his lap. "Sorry. I came straight from the shop. The humidity was messing with the varnish on the—" "I don't care about the varnish, Thomas," she interrupted, picking up her wine glass. She didn't drink. She just held it as a prop. "I don't care about the wood, or the sawdust, or the artistry. I care that every time we go out, I feel like I'm dining with the hired help." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. For 5 years, he had supported her. When she was an intern making coffee, he paid the rent. When she went back to school for marketing, he built her a desk with his own hands so she'd have a perfect place to study. Now that she was a director, those same hands were an embarrassment. "I'm a carpenter, Laura," he said quietly. "It's honest work." "It's small work," she shot back, her eyes flashing. "It's dusty, small, dead-end work. Look at this room. Look at the men here. They run companies. They move markets. You move tables." Her phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up. "James, client." The message preview was short. "Waiting for you." Thomas stared at the name. He knew James. He was the CEO of the tech startup Laura had been consulting for. He was the man Laura quoted constantly. "James says the market is shifting. James thinks we should vacation in Aspen." "You should answer him," Thomas said. Laura froze. "It's work." "Is it?" Thomas asked. He looked her in the eye, really looked at her, and saw the stranger she had become. "You've been different for months, Laura. You come home late. You smell like expensive cologne that isn't mine. You look at me with pity." Laura set the glass down hard. "It's not pity, Thomas. It's exhaustion. I'm tired of pulling you up. I'm tired of being the only one with ambition. James operates on a frequency that you wouldn't understand. He makes things happen. You just wait." "So you were sleeping with him?" It wasn't a question. Laura didn't flinch. She straightened her posture, armoring herself in her cold professionalism. "He appreciates me. He sees my value. He doesn't hold me back with small-town dreams of owning a woodshop. You're not worth my time anymore, Thomas. I've outgrown this. I've outgrown us." She looked at her watch. "I'm going to meet him. Tonight. I want a divorce, Thomas. I'll send the papers to your shop. I assume that's where you'll be sleeping." The brutality of it was breathtaking. She was discarding 5 years of marriage between the appetizer and the entree. Thomas sat in silence for a long moment. The anger he expected didn't come. Instead, he felt a sudden, profound clarity. The contract he had signed that morning, The partnership with the Ritz-Carlton Group to design the furniture for their new global line was sitting in his email. The advance payment was already in his account. He was currently, quietly, one of the highest-paid craftsmen in the state. But she didn't know, and she didn't deserve to know. "You're right," Thomas said. He reached into his jacket pocket. Laura rolled her eyes. "Please don't cry. Or write me a poem. I can't handle the melodrama." Thomas pulled out a thick, manila envelope. He placed it on the table. It landed with a heavy thud that made the silverware jump. "What is this?" Laura asked, frowning. $30,000, Thomas said calmly. Laura's mouth opened slightly. "What? Cash?" Thomas continued, standing up. He brushed a speck of invisible sawdust from his jacket. "That covers the last year of rent you constantly reminded me you paid. It covers the lease on your Mercedes. And it covers this dinner." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "You talked about value, Laura. You talked about time. That's my reimbursement for yours. Consider us even." "Where did you get this?" Laura hissed, reaching for the envelope, her greed momentarily overriding her poise. "Did you steal it? Did you take a loan?" "I built something," Thomas said. "Something real. But you were too busy looking at your phone to notice." He buttoned his jacket. "James is waiting. You shouldn't keep the boss waiting." "Thomas, wait," Laura said, her voice faltering as she touched the thickness of the envelope. "Thomas." He turned his back on her. He walked through the dining room, past the stunned waiter, past the maitre d', and out into the biting wind of the Chicago night. He felt light. He felt clean. Inside, Laura ripped open the envelope. The stack of $100 bills was crisp, smelling of fresh ink. Tucked in the band of the first stack was a note written on the back of a sandpaper grit label. "Don't worry about the furniture in the condo. I built it. I'm taking it back." Her phone buzzed again. "James, I'm downstairs. Hurry up." Laura looked at the cash, then at the empty chair. A shiver of true fear ran down her spine, cold and sharp. Understood. The wind off Lake Michigan was a physical weight, slamming against the side of Thomas's Ford F-150 as he drove south toward the industrial district. It was a bitter, biting cold that usually seeped into his bones, but tonight, the cabin of the truck felt strangely warm. It was the warmth of ownership. This truck, the tools in the back, the skills in his hands, they were the only things he hadn't compromised. He didn't check into a hotel. A hotel felt transient, desperate. Instead, he pulled up to the corrugated metal gate of his workshop. The building was an old brick warehouse he had been leasing for 3 years, a space Laura had visited exactly once. She had complained about the dust on her heels and waited in the car. Thomas rolled up the heavy steel door, the chain rattling like a chaotic melody in the silence of the night. He drove the truck inside and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. The air smelled of cedar, linseed oil, and curing varnish, scents that made sense to him. He walked over to the corner where he kept a small cot for nights when deadlines pushed past 2 a.m. He unfolded it. He took his suit jacket off, hanging it carefully on a peg next to his shop apron. He looked at the piece covered in a drop cloth in the center of the room, the prototype for the Aurora line. He pulled the cloth back. The walnut desk curved like a frozen wave, the joinery invisible, the surface polished to a mirror finish. It was a masterpiece worth more than the car Laura drove. He ran his hand along the edge. He was sleeping in a warehouse, his marriage was over, and he had $30,000 less in his bank account than he did this morning. Yet, as he lay down on the thin mattress, staring up at the iron rafters, Thomas realized he hadn't taken a breath this deep in years. He wasn't waiting for anyone's permission anymore. 5 miles north, in the rarefied air of the Gold Coast, Laura stepped out of the elevator and directly into the penthouse foyer. The space was magnificent, floor-to-ceiling glass, Italian marble floors, and a view that turned Chicago into a grid of glowing jewels. It was everything she had screamed at Thomas for not giving her. "James," she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, open-concept living room. She clutched her purse tightly against her side. The envelope of cash was still inside, a heavy, jagged lump against her hip. She had expected James to be waiting with champagne. She had expected a celebration. She had just blown up her life to be here, after all. In the study, James's voice floated out, distracted and sharp. Laura walked toward the sound. She found James standing by the window, a headset on, pacing back and forth. He wasn't wearing the tuxedo he had promised to change into. He was still in his office slacks and a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He held up a finger, silencing her before she could speak. "No. Look, the valuation is garbage," James said into the headset, his eyes scanning a tablet in his other hand. "I don't care what the Asian markets are doing. If we don't hit the Q3 targets, the IPO is dead. Fix it." He tapped the headset off and tossed it onto the glass desk. Finally, he looked at her. "Hey," he said, offering a tired, tight smile. "You made it." "I made it," Laura said, trying to infuse her voice with the seduction she thought this moment required. She walked over to him, placing a hand on his chest. "I did it, James. I left him. It's done." James looked at her hand, then back at his tablet. "That's great, babe. Really. Proud of you. That guy was dead weight anyway." He pulled away gently, walking toward the wet bar. "Drink? I need a scotch. The Seoul office is a disaster right now." Laura stood frozen in the middle of the room. Her hand fell to her side. "James, it's my birthday. And I just ended my marriage. I thought we were going out." James poured amber liquid into a tumbler, not bothering to ask if she wanted ice. I know, but I can't leave the terminal right now. The market is volatile. We can order in. That sushi place you like." He took a sip, grimacing. "Besides, you're here now. Isn't that the point? You don't have to go back to that sawdust apartment." Laura looked around the room. It was beautiful, undeniably. It was the cover of a magazine. But there were no photos of family. No books that looked red. No warmth. Just expensive surfaces that repelled dust and intimacy alike. She thought of the restaurant. She thought of Thomas standing up, buttoning his jacket with that strange, quiet dignity she hadn't seen in a decade. She thought of the cash. "Yeah," Laura whispered, a cold knot forming in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. "That's the point." "Great," James said, already looking back at his screen. "Grab a glass if you want. I just need 20 minutes. Laura walked to the window. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, looking down at the city lights. Somewhere out there, in the darkness of the industrial sprawl, was her husband. Or her ex-husband. She expected to feel relieved. She expected to feel like a winner. Instead, she felt like an accessory that had just been placed on a shelf, waiting for its owner to find the time to look at it. Underscore. The morning light filtering into the condo was gray and unforgiving, exposing the dust motes dancing in the air of the silent living room. Laura sat cross-legged on the beige sectional, her posture rigid, a mug of lukewarm matcha tea untouched on the coaster beside her. In her hands, her phone was a weapon of revisionist history. She was scrolling back through her Instagram feed, thumb hovering over a photo from 3 years ago. It was a picture of her and Thomas at a street festival. He was laughing, holding a corn dog, wearing a faded flannel shirt that she had always hated. She looked happy in the photo, genuinely happy, with windblown hair and no makeup. It didn't fit the brand. Laura tapped the 3 dots in the corner. Delete. The image vanished, the grid shifting instantly to fill the hole. She moved to the next one. A shot of the coffee table Thomas had built for their first anniversary. Delete. A selfie of them in the truck. Delete. It was terrifyingly easy. 5 years of marriage, of shared breaths and shared struggles, were being dismantled one tap at a time. With every deletion, Laura told herself she was cleaning house. She was curating a life that matched the woman who stood in James's penthouse the night before. She was making room for the future. When the digital purge was complete, she changed her bio. The word wife was backspaced into oblivion. In its place, she typed, PR director. Tech enthusiast. Evolving. She stared at the word evolving. It felt powerful. It felt like a justification. She set the phone down and stood up, the silence of the apartment pressing against her ears. The digital erasure was done. Now came the physical extraction. Laura walked into the bedroom. Thomas had taken nothing but the suit on his back. His side of the walk-in closet was still full, a silent testament to a life interrupted. She grabbed a stack of heavy-duty garbage bags from the kitchen and returned, snapping one open with a violent wrist flick. She started with the shirts, the flannels, the heavy cotton tees, the work jackets that always smelled faintly of pine and sweat. She didn't fold them. She grabbed them in handfuls, shoving them into the black plastic maw. She treated the fabric like contamination. If she moved fast enough, she wouldn't have to remember the way his shoulder felt under that specific blue denim shirt. She moved to the bedside table. His sketchpad was there. She flipped it open. It was filled with drawings of joints, angles, and furniture legs. There was a sketch of a crib on the last page. Laura froze. Her breath hitched. They had talked about it once, casually, a year ago. She had told him not yet. She hadn't realized he had already started designing it. She ripped the page out. She crumpled it into a tight ball and threw it into the bag. He's small time, she reminded herself, the mantra James had unknowingly planted in her head. He dreams in wood. I dream in silicon and steel. She went to the hallway closet where Thomas kept his home tools, the ones he didn't leave at the shop. A vintage hand plane, a set of chisels in a leather roll, a Japanese pole saw. These were expensive tools, heirloom quality. Thomas oiled them every Sunday. Laura swept them into a cardboard box intended for Goodwill. She tossed the heavy metal plane in with a clang that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet hallway. She didn't care if the blade chipped. She wanted the weight of him gone. By noon, the apartment was sterilized. 3 black bags and 2 boxes sat by the front door. The closet was half empty, looking gaping and unbalanced. Laura walked to the mirror in the hallway. She fixed her hair, applying a fresh coat of lipstick. She looked successful. She looked unburdened. She looked alone. She pulled out her phone and snapped a selfie in the now pristine mirror. She tilted her head, catching the light, making sure the emptiness behind her looked intentional, like minimalist design rather than abandonment. She posted it to her story with a single caption, "Clean slate." Within seconds, the notifications started rolling in. Likes, fire emojis, a heart from James. Laura smiled at the screen, a dopamine hit that almost masked the phantom smell of sawdust that still lingered, stubborn and earthy, in the air she was trying so hard to scrub clean. Underscore. For the next 3 weeks, time in the workshop did not move by the clock. It moved by the grit of sandpaper. 80 grit to strip away the rough exterior. 120 to smooth the scars. 220 to prepare the surface. 400 to make it sing. Thomas lived in a haze of sawdust and caffeine. He woke up on the cot before the sun hit the high industrial windows, brewed a pot of coffee that tasted like battery acid, and went straight to the bench. He stopped only when his hands shook too much to hold a chisel safely. He didn't turn on his phone. He didn't check his email. He simply worked. The project was the Aurora Line, a commission for the new flagship Ritz-Carlton in Tokyo. They wanted something that felt American but looked timeless. Black walnut, brass, and leather. It was the kind of furniture that would sit in rooms costing $2,000 a night, rooms where people like Laura and James would stay, never knowing that the man who shaped the headboard slept on a camping cot in South Chicago. The physical labor was a mercy. When the router screamed against the grain, he couldn't hear Laura's voice calling him small time. When he focused on the microscopic gap of a dovetail joint, he didn't have to think about the empty side of the bed. On a Tuesday afternoon, the heavy steel door of the workshop rolled up. The sunlight sliced through the dust-filled air, blinding Thomas for a moment. He was covered in shavings, wearing a t-shirt that had once been white, but was now a map of sweat and stain. A man stepped in. He wore a navy suit that cost more than the machinery in the room. It was Marcus Sterling, the acquisition director for the hotel group. He looked out of place among the table saws and drill presses, like a panther walking through a junkyard. "Thomas," Marcus said, his voice booming in the cavernous space. "You're hard to reach. We sent 3 emails." Thomas wiped his hands on a rag, stepping forward. "I've been busy, Marcus. The prototypes are ready." He didn't apologize. He didn't scramble to offer water. He simply gestured to the center of the room. Under the harsh shop lights, the collection stood arranged like a silent orchestra. The desk, the lounge chair, the low-profile bed frame. They were magnificent. The walnut glowed with a deep, rich fire, the brass accents catching the light with subtle elegance. It was raw nature tamed by obsessive precision. Marcus walked around the desk slowly. He ran a manicured hand over the surface. He checked the drawers. He sat in the chair. The silence stretched for a full minute. Thomas stood with his arms crossed, his heart hammering against his ribs, though his face remained stone. Finally, Marcus looked up. He wasn't smiling. He looked serious, almost reverent. "We want exclusive rights," Marcus said, "for the global chain, not just Tokyo. We want this in Dubai, London, and New York." "That wasn't the original deal," Thomas said calmly. "No," Marcus agreed. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and laid it on the workbench, right next to a pile of wood scraps. "This is the new deal. We're buying the design IP, and we're retaining you as the lead consultant for the manufacturing rollout." Marcus uncapped a fountain pen. "The advance is $2.5 million, with a 5% royalty on every unit produced for the next 10 years. Thomas looked at the paper. The numbers were black and stark. $2.5 million. It was a number that didn't feel real. It was a number that meant he never had to sand a floor for rent money again. It was a number that Laura would have killed for. He picked up the pen. His hand, usually steady enough to slice a millimeter of wood, trembled slightly. "You realize," Thomas said, looking at the suit, "I'm just a carpenter." "Not anymore," Marcus replied. "Now you're a brand." Thomas signed. The ink flowed onto the paper, binding him to a future he hadn't dared to imagine a month ago. Marcus took the papers, shook Thomas's sawdust-covered hand firmly, and left. The roller door rattled down, sealing the workshop back into its dusty twilight. Thomas stood alone in the center of the room. He looked at the check Marcus had left, a physical deposit slip for the wire transfer that was already processing. He should have felt ecstatic. He should have yelled. He should have called someone. But there was no one to call. Thomas walked over to the mini fridge in the corner. He pulled out a cold, cheap beer. He cracked it open and took a long drink, leaning against the $2 million desk. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. He looked exactly the same as he had yesterday. Dirty, tired, alone. "Cheers," he whispered to the empty room. He took another sip, the taste of cheap hops mixing with the realization that he had just won the game Laura didn't even know he was playing. But as the adrenaline faded, the silence of the shop returned, louder than before. He had the money. He had the success. Now, he just had to figure out who he was without the woman he had built it all for. The notification sound on Laura's phone used to be a dopamine hit. Now, 3 weeks into her new life, it sounded like a warning shot. Laura sat in the glass-walled conference room of her PR firm, the Chicago skyline gray and oppressive behind her. It was 7:30 p.m. The rest of the office had gone home, but Laura was still there, staring at a crisis management strategy for James's company. Their latest app update had crashed, leaking minor user data, and James expected her to spin it into a narrative about security upgrades. Her phone buzzed again. "James, where's the press release? I have investors breathing down my neck." "Don't make me look stupid, Laura." She typed back, her thumbs aching. "Drafting it now. I'll send it in 10 minutes. "Make it 5, came the instant reply. Laura set the phone down, her hand trembling slightly. This was the dynamic now. There were no more stolen glances across dinner tables or exciting secret rendezvous. Since she had left Thomas, James had stopped treating her like a conquest and started treating her like an asset, one he owned. The romance had evaporated the moment she became available. She finished the release, hit send, and slumped back in her errand chair. She was hungry. Not just hungry, but hollow. In the old life, the life she had thrown away, she would have come home to the smell of roasted chicken or a simple pasta dish. Thomas would have been there, wiping his hands on a towel, asking her about her day, listening to her vent while he poured her a glass of wine. He was the ground wire that absorbed her static. Now, she was the entire circuit, and she was overheating. Laura packed up her bag and took a rideshare home. She didn't drive the Mercedes anymore. The lease payment was due, and without Thomas's invisible contributions to the household bills, her liquidity was tighter than she admitted. When she unlocked the door to her condo, the silence didn't greet her, it confronted her. The apartment was a mess. Not a catastrophic disaster, but a slow, creeping accumulation of neglect. A pile of unopened mail teetered on the console table. A basket of laundry sat in the hallway, overflowing. The kitchen sink held 3 days of coffee mugs and takeout containers. She had never realized how much Thomas did. He did the laundry on Sundays. He paid the bills on Mondays. He watered the plants on Wednesdays. He fixed the leaky faucet before she even knew it was dripping. He had curated an environment where she could thrive, where she could be the high-powered executive because he was the foundation holding the floor steady. Now, the floor was tilting. Laura kicked off her heels and walked to the fridge. It was empty, save for a bottle of expensive champagne she had bought to celebrate her freedom and a carton of expired almond milk. She closed the fridge door and leaned her forehead against the cold stainless steel. Her phone rang. It was James. She took a deep breath, fixing her work voice, and answered. "Hi, James. Did you get the release?" "I got it," James said. No greeting. "No, how are you?" "It's weak, Laura." Passive voice in the second paragraph. "And you didn't mention the encryption protocol." "I can fix it," Laura said, pinching the bridge of her nose. I'm exhausted, James. I just got home." "Welcome to the big leagues," James scoffed. "You wanted to run with the winners, right? Winners don't get tired at 8 p.m. Fix the release and send it back to me. And cancel dinner tomorrow. I have to fly to San Francisco." "But tomorrow is our 1-month anniversary," Laura said, the words slipping out before she could check them. It sounded pathetic even to her own ears. There was a pause on the line. A cold, heavy silence. "Laura," James said, his voice dropping to a tone one might use with a slow child. "We aren't in high school. I'm running a company. You're handling my PR. Don't blur the lines with sentimental garbage. It makes you look unprofessional." The line went dead. Laura pulled the phone away from her ear. She stared at the screen, at the contact photo she had set of James, a candid shot of him laughing on a yacht. He looked so charming, so powerful. She realized then, with a sinking horror, that she hadn't upgraded her partner. She had simply traded a husband who loved her for a boss who used her. She looked around the darkening kitchen, at the dirty dishes and the empty counters. She wanted to call Thomas. She wanted to hear his steady, calm voice tell her it would be okay. But she couldn't. She had burned that bridge, and now she was standing on the other side, realizing too late that the grass wasn't greener. It was just astroturf, plastic and hard, laid over concrete. Laura opened the cupboard, found a bag of stale pretzels, and ate them standing up over the sink, crying silently into the stainless steel basin. The flash of the camera was blinding, a sharp burst of white light that left spots dancing in Thomas's vision. "Chin down slightly," the photographer instructed. "Look at the lens like you look at a piece of unworked timber. Assess it." Thomas shifted in the uncomfortable designer chair. He was in a studio loft in the West Loop, surrounded by stylists, assistants, and a PR team provided by the Ritz-Carlton Group. They had dressed him in a navy cashmere sweater and dark denim, rugged but expensive. They wanted the artist monk aesthetic. "Perfect," the photographer said, the shutter clicking rapidly. "That's the cover. Thomas endured it with the same stoicism he applied to sanding a difficult grain. He didn't enjoy the attention, but he understood the utility of it. Marcus Sterling had been clear. The story sells the furniture, Thomas. The silent craftsman in a noisy world. People are starving for authenticity. Thomas was the authenticity they were selling. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Laura was fighting a losing battle with Chicago traffic. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the taillights of the cars ahead into streaks of angry red. She was gripping the steering wheel of the Mercedes, her knuckles white. She was late. Again. James had moved to the client dinner up by 30 minutes without telling her, and now he was texting her every 3 minutes asking where she was. "You're making us look disorganized," Laura, the last text read. "I'm trying," she whispered to the empty car, her voice cracking. The wipers slapped back and forth, a rhythmic metronome to her rising panic. She decided to take a shortcut through the design district to avoid the gridlock on the Kennedy Expressway. It was a risk, but she had no choice. She swerved the car onto the exit ramp, tires splashing through deep puddles. The design district was a canyon of brick warehouses converted into luxury showrooms. Even in the rain, the storefronts glowed with the warm, inviting light of high-end Italian sofas and Scandinavian lighting. Laura stopped at a red light at the intersection of Grand and Wells. She reached for her phone to text James in ETA. Then she looked up. Directly across the intersection, draped over the side of a 4-story brick building, was a massive vinyl banner. It was brand new, the colors vivid against the gray sky. It was an advertisement for the Aurora collection, and taking up half the billboard was a face she knew better than her own. Laura dropped her phone. It clattered into the footwell, but she didn't move to retrieve it. She just stared, her mouth slightly open, breath fogging the windshield. It was Thomas. But it wasn't the Thomas she had left. It wasn't the man with sawdust in his hair and a quiet apology on his lips. This Thomas looked powerful. He was photographed in black and white, standing in his workshop, arms crossed, looking away from the camera with a gaze that was intense and unyielding. His hands, the hands she had been ashamed of, were in the foreground, resting on a piece of sleek, dark walnut furniture. The tagline ran across his chest in elegant, gold serif font. "True value is built, not bought. The Aurora line. By Thomas Wright." "No," Laura whispered. That's not possible." The light turned green. The car behind her honked aggressively. Laura didn't move. She couldn't process the image. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. A billboard like that cost $10,000 a month. The branding was world-class. She hurriedly put the car in park and grabbed her iPad from the passenger seat. Her hands were shaking so badly she mistyped his name twice. She searched Thomas Wright Aurora line. The results flooded the screen. Architectural Digest. The carpenter who just signed a $5 million deal. Vogue Living. Why the Ritz-Carlton's new aesthetic is blue-collar luxury. Crane's Chicago Business. The quiet rise of Thomas Wright. She clicked the first article. The date on the contract announcement was 3 days before she left him. Laura felt the blood drain from her face. He had known. That night at the restaurant, when she called him small time, when she called him a dead weight. He had already signed the deal. He had the money in his pocket. He hadn't argued with her. He hadn't tried to prove her wrong. He had just paid the bill and left. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He didn't need her validation. He never had. She had been the one needing him to be small so she could feel big. And now, looming 4 stories high above her in the rain, he was a giant. The car behind her honked again, a long, sustained blast. Laura slammed her foot on the gas, the Mercedes fishtailing slightly on the wet asphalt. She drove blindly, tears hot and sudden stinging her eyes. She needed to tell someone. She needed James to tell her it was just a fluke, just a lucky break. She dialed James on the car's Bluetooth. "Where are you?" James answered, his voice icy. "The client is ordering drinks." "James," Laura choked out. "Did you see? Have you seen the news about the Ritz deal?" "What deal?" "I don't care about hotels, Laura. I care that my PR director is missing." "It's Thomas," she said. "My Thomas. He's the designer. He's everywhere." "So?" James sounded bored. Good for him. Maybe now he can afford a better lawyer for the divorce. Get here, Laura. Stop making everything about your ex. He hung up. The disconnect tone buzzed through the speakers. Laura drove past another bus stop. There was a smaller poster there. Thomas's eyes seemed to follow her, calm and judging, watching her race toward a man who didn't care if she crashed, as long as she arrived on time. Underscore. PHN2, Chapter 7, 11. The valet stand outside Gibson's Italia was crowded, the air thick with the smell of exhaust and expensive perfume. Laura sat in her car, the engine idling, the wipers slicing back and forth across the windshield like a metronome counting down a disaster. She was 10 minutes late. James was inside. She knew exactly what he would say when she walked in. He would make a joke about her time management in front of the client, a small, jagged barb wrapped in a smile. But she couldn't open the door. Her thumb hovered over the contact name on her phone screen. Thomas. She hadn't changed it. It was just Thomas. Not husband. Not the carpenter. Just the name that used to anchor her reality. Just call him. She whispered to herself, her breath hitching. It's professional. You're in PR. You saw a campaign. You're congratulating him. It's normal. She pressed the call button before she could talk herself out of it. Across the city, in a private booth at a quiet, dim lounge in the West Loop, Thomas was holding a glass of aged bourbon. He was sitting with Marcus Sterling and the creative director of the campaign. The mood was light, a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the workshop. The engagement numbers are insane, the creative director was saying. People love the story, Thomas. The monk in the machine age angle? It's polling through the roof. Thomas smiled politely. I just built the furniture, Sarah. You guys wrote the story. You lived the story, Marcus corrected, raising his glass. Then, Thomas's phone buzzed on the mahogany table. The screen lit up. Laura. The conversation at the table didn't stop, but Thomas's world narrowed to that glowing rectangle. For a split second, a reflex kicked in, the old reflex to answer immediately, to ask what she needed, to fix whatever was broken. But he looked at his hands. They were clean. He looked at the bourbon. It was expensive. He looked at the company he was keeping. They respected him. You need to get that? Marcus asked, glancing at the phone. Could be the press. Thomas looked at the screen one last time. He saw the name, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel the need to apologize for his existence. No, Thomas said calmly. He reached out and flipped the phone face down. It's spam, he added. In the car, the ringing tone went on and on. 1 ring. 2. 3. 4. Pick up, Laura prayed. Pick up so I can hear your voice. Pick up so I know you're not really that guy on the billboard. You have reached the voicemail of Thomas Wright. Please leave a message. The beep sounded harsh and mechanical. Laura panic spiraled. She shouldn't speak. She should hang up. But the silence of the car was too loud, and the loneliness was too sharp. Hi, Thomas, she stammered. Her voice sounded thin, brittle. It's Laura. Obviously. She let out a nervous, breathy laugh that sounded like a sob. I was just driving through River North and I saw the billboard. The Aurora line? My God, Thomas. It's huge. You look incredible. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. I didn't know. You never told me you were working on something this big. I mean Ritz-Carlton? That's amazing. She paused. She knew she should end it there, but she couldn't. Things are crazy with the agency. James's. Well, you know how intense launches get. I just thought, maybe when the dust settles, we could get coffee. Just to catch up? There's a lot of paperwork to sort out anyway. And, I don't know. I'd love to hear about the design. She waited, as if he might interrupt the recording. Nothing but dead air. Okay. Well, congratulations. Really. Call me back. She ended the call. She sat there, staring at the screen, feeling a wave of humiliation wash over her so hot it made her skin prickle. She had sounded desperate. She had sounded exactly like the thing she despised, a hanger-on. Knock, knock, knock. Laura jumped, dropping the phone. James was standing outside the driver's side window, holding a large umbrella. His face was twisted in annoyance. He gestured for her to roll down the window. Laura lowered the glass. The cold rain blew in, hitting her face. "Are you going to sit in the parking lot all night?" James snapped. "The client is asking if you're sick. I told them you were parking. You've been out here 10 minutes. I was just finishing a call," Laura said, wiping a stray tear from her cheek before he could see it. "Who?" James asked, peering into the car. "Not the carpenter, I hope." Laura froze. "No, just office stuff." "Good," James said, turning back toward the restaurant. "Because looking backward is bad for business. Come on, fix your face. You look a mess." He walked away without offering her the umbrella. Laura watched him go. Then she looked at her phone, face up on the passenger seat, silent and dark. She realized then that Thomas hadn't just not answered. He had let it ring. He had watched her call and decided she wasn't worth the interruption. For the first time, she understood exactly how he had felt at that anniversary dinner. The tech-forward Chicago Gala was held in the Great Hall of Union Station, a cavernous space of marble columns and soaring ceilings that had been transformed with blue LED uplighting and aggressive electronic music. It was the kind of event where the champagne was vintage, but the conversations were cheap. Laura stood next to James, her feet aching in 6-inch stilettos. She wore a silver gown that James had selected for her. It was backless, plunging, and stunning, but she felt less like a woman wearing a dress and more like a device in a protective case. James was in his element. He held a glass of scotch in one hand and gestured expansively with the other, holding court with a circle of venture capitalists and junior developers who hung on his every word. "The key isn't just disruption," James was saying, his voice loud enough to carry over the bass. "It's annihilation. You don't just build a better mousetrap. You remove the mouse's reason to exist." The circle laughed, a sycophantic, hollow sound. Laura forced a smile, shifting her weight. She had been standing there for 40 minutes. James hadn't introduced her once. To the group, she was just the decorative object holding his spare cocktail napkin. James, a balding investor named Peter, interrupted, his eyes drifting to Laura. "You haven't introduced us. Is this the new VP of marketing I heard about?" Laura straightened up, extending her hand. "Actually, this is Laura," James cut in, not looking at her. "She runs PR. She handles the soft skills. Make sure we don't say anything too honest to the press." He didn't take his hand off his drink to touch the small of her back. "He didn't say my girlfriend. He didn't say my partner." Peter shook Laura's hand limply. "PR, tough gig. Especially with this one," he pointed at James. "So, how long have you two been collaborating?" It was a loaded question. Everyone in the circle knew the rumors. They knew Laura had left her husband right as James's company started its Series B funding. "It's fairly new," Laura said, trying to salvage some dignity. "But we have a shared vision we're testing the waters." James interrupted again, his tone sharp. He took a sip of scotch, his eyes scanning the room for someone more important. "You know how it is with software, Peter. You never commit to the beta version until you've worked out all the bugs." The circle went quiet. The insult was precise, surgical, and humiliating. He had just compared her to a buggy piece of software, a temporary trial run. Laura felt the blood drain from her face. "James," she whispered, a warning tone in her voice. James looked at her then, his eyes cold and glassy with alcohol. "What? It's a metaphor, Laura. Don't be so sensitive. That's exactly what I mean about the bugs." A few of the junior developers snickered, covering their mouths. Laura looked around the circle. These were the people she had wanted to impress. These were the winners she had left Thomas for. And they were looking at her with a mix of pity and amusement. Suddenly, the memory of Thomas at a backyard barbecue 2 years ago flooded her mind. Someone had made a joke about Laura being high maintenance because she didn't eat potato salad. Thomas had immediately put his arm around her and said, "She knows what she wants. That's why she's the boss." He had defended her over a scoop of potatoes. James wouldn't even defend her over her own dignity. "I need a drink," Laura said, her voice shaking. "Grab me a refill while you're there," James said, holding out his empty glass without looking at her. "And check in with the event coordinator. The music is too loud." He treated her like a waitress. Laura looked at the empty glass in his hand. For a split second, she considered throwing it. She considered screaming. But she was a PR director. She was trained to manage optics. She took the glass. "Sure," she said softly. She turned and walked away. She walked through the crowd, past the ice sculptures and the holographic displays. She didn't go to the bar. She didn't go to the event coordinator. She walked straight to the coat check. "Ticket?" the attendant asked. "I don't have it," Laura said, her eyes burning. "It's a white trench coat. Just give it to me." She grabbed the coat, throwing it over her silver dress. She pushed through the heavy revolving doors out onto Canal Street. The night air was freezing, but it felt better than the suffocating heat of the gala. She stood on the curb, shivering, hugging herself. She was the woman who had everything: the job, the dress, the powerful boyfriend. And she had never felt more like nothing. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. A text from James. "Where's my drink? Elon's guy just walked in. I need you here." Laura looked at the message. She typed a reply, her fingers numb. "I'm done with the beta test." She hit send, threw the phone into her purse, and raised her hand for a taxi, desperate to go anywhere that didn't smell like expensive cologne and betrayal. The Aurora exhibition was being held at the Astor Gates Restored Bank building on the south side, a venue that screamed high art and cultural capital. The limestone facade was lit up with tasteful, warm floodlights, and a line of black SUVs idled at the curb, depositing Chicago's cultural elite onto the red carpet. Laura watched from the other side of the street. She had ditched the gala, ditched James, and hailed a cab to the one place she knew Thomas would be. She was still wearing the backless silver gown, now hidden under her damp trench coat, her hair windblown and frizzing from the humidity. She didn't look like a PR director anymore. She looked like a ghost haunting the living. She crossed the street, dodging a slow-moving Bentley. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had a plan. She would walk in, find Thomas, and apologize. Not a text, not a voicemail. A real apology. She would tell him she made a mistake. She would tell him that the billboard changed everything. Not because of the money, she would lie to herself, but because she finally saw him. She reached the velvet rope. A large man with an earpiece and a tablet stood guard. "Name?" he asked, not looking up. "Laura Wright," she said breathlessly. She used her married name. She hadn't used it in months. I'm his wife." The bouncer paused. He scrolled through the list on his tablet. His finger swiped up, then down. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I have a Thomas Wright as the host," the bouncer said. "But the guest list is strictly RSVP. You aren't on it, ma'am." "There must be a mistake," Laura insisted, stepping closer. "I'm his wife." "Well, we're separated, but it's complicated. Please, just tell him Laura is here. He'll want to see me." The bouncer looked at her clothes, the expensive but damp coat, the desperate eyes. He had seen this look 1,000 times before. It was the look of someone who realized they were on the wrong side of the door too late. "I can't do that, ma'am." Mr. Wright gave specific instructions. "No unexpected guests, especially not media or personal complications." "I'm not a complication." Laura's voice rose, cracking. "I'm the reason he's here. I supported him for 5 years." People in the line turned to stare. A woman in a fur stole whispered to her husband. Laura felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't back down. "Please," she whispered. "Just 1 minute." The bouncer shook his head. "Step back, please. You're blocking the entrance." Defeated, Laura stepped aside. She didn't leave, though. She walked along the side of the building to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that looked in on the gallery floor. The glass was thick, soundproof, but transparent. It framed the scene inside like a movie screen. The gallery was warm and golden. Thomas's furniture was arranged on pedestals, looking less like chairs and tables and more like sculptures. The walnut glowed under the museum lights. And there was Thomas. He was standing in the center of the room, holding a glass of champagne. He looked devastatingly handsome in a tuxedo that fit him perfectly. No sawdust, no rough edges. He was talking to a small group of people. Laura pressed her hand against the cold glass. Then, a woman walked up to him. It was Sarah, the creative director she had seen in the press photos. She wasn't wearing a flashy silver dress. She wore a simple, elegant black suit. She placed a hand on Thomas's arm, a gesture that was familiar, easy, and intimate. Thomas turned to her. He didn't look annoyed. He didn't look stoic. He smiled. It was a smile Laura hadn't seen in years, open, genuine, and reaching his eyes. He said something that made Sarah laugh, throwing her head back. Then, Sarah reached out and fixed Thomas's lapel. It was a small thing, a tiny, domestic adjustment, but it shattered Laura. It was the kind of thing a wife did. Laura watched as Thomas took Sarah's hand and led her toward the centerpiece of the collection, the desk. He pointed out a detail in the joinery. His face lit up with passion. Sarah listened intently, nodding, her eyes on his face, not his phone or his wallet. Laura realized with a sickening clarity that she wasn't just outside the building. She was outside the narrative. She wasn't the protagonist of Thomas's story anymore. She wasn't even the villain. She was just a background character who had been written out of the script seasons ago. Inside the warm gallery, Thomas raised a toast. The room applauded. Outside in the cold Chicago night, Laura slid down the brick wall until she was crouching on the wet pavement. The silver dress pooled around her like spilled mercury. She buried her face in her hands. The image of Thomas's happy smile burned into her retinas, brighter and more painful than any billboard. Underscore. The gallery lights dimmed one by one, turning the golden aquarium of the showroom into a dark, reflective cavern. The rain had slowed to a cold, persistent mist that coated the sidewalks of the south side in a slick sheen. Laura was still waiting. She stood near the valet stand, shivering in her trench coat, the silver hem of her gown dragging on the wet concrete. She had watched the guests filter out, the critics, the buyers, the socialites. She had watched them get into their black cars and vanish into the night. Finally, the heavy glass doors opened. Thomas walked out. He wasn't alone. Marcus Sterling and Sarah were flanking him, laughing at something he had just said. Thomas looked relaxed, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, a scarf loosely draped around his neck. He looked like a man who had just conquered the world and found it surprisingly light. Laura stepped out from the shadows of a brick pillar. Thomas. The name cracked in the air like a dry twig. The group stopped. Marcus looked at Laura, his brow furrowing as he took in her disheveled appearance. Sarah's expression softened into something resembling pity, which stung Laura more than judgment. Thomas didn't flinch. He looked at Laura, his eyes adjusting to the streetlights. He held up a hand to his colleagues. "Give me a minute," Thomas said quietly. "We'll pull the car around," Marcus said, ushering Sarah toward a waiting sedan. They didn't look back. Thomas stood on the curb, 5 feet away from her. He didn't close the distance. He didn't offer his coat. "You shouldn't be here, Laura," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. "I had to see it," Laura said, her voice trembling. She took a step forward, but Thomas's posture remained rigid, a silent wall she couldn't breach. "I saw the billboard. I saw the reviews. Thomas, it's beautiful. Everything you made. It's beautiful." "Thank you," he said. "I tried to call," she continued, words spilling out in a rush. "I wanted to tell you. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. James isn't who I thought he was. He's hollow, Thomas. He's not like you." Thomas put his hands in his pockets. "I know who James is, Laura. I knew who he was when you were texting him at our anniversary dinner." "I was lost," Laura pleaded. "I was scared. I thought you were stuck. I thought we were going nowhere. I pushed you because I knew you were capable of this. Don't you see? If I hadn't done what I did, if I hadn't left, You never would have built this. She reached out, her hand hovering in the damp air between them. I was the catalyst, Thomas. In a twisted way. We did this together. Thomas looked at her hand, then up at her eyes. He shook his head slowly, a sad smile touching his lips. No, he said softly. Don't do that. Don't take credit for my survival. I'm not. You broke me, Laura. Thomas interrupted, his voice steady and devoid of malice. You didn't push me to greatness. You pushed me off a cliff. I built this parachute on the way down because I had no other choice. I built it because the silence in that workshop was the only thing that didn't judge me. He took a step closer, not to embrace her, but to ensure she heard him clearly over the hum of the city. I signed the contract with the Ritz 3 days before you left me, he revealed. Laura gasped, her eyes widening. What? I had the money, Thomas said. I had the deal. I was going to tell you that night. I was going to buy us a house by the lake. I was going to give you everything you said you wanted. He watched the realization shatter her. He watched her understand that she hadn't left a sinking ship. She had jumped off a yacht just before it set sail. But you didn't want a partner, Thomas continued. You wanted a product. You wanted someone who looked good on a gala invite. And when you thought my value was low, you sold. Thomas, please, Laura sobbed, tears finally spilling over, mixing with the rain on her cheeks. I can change. I can be better. We have history. 5 years. You can't just erase 5 years. I didn't erase them, Thomas said. I built over them. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, and Sarah looked out, her expression concerned. Thomas. Thomas turned his head, nodding to her. I'm coming. He looked back at Laura one last time. Go home, Laura, he said. Find out who you are when there's no one to impress. That's the only work that matters. Don't leave me here, she whispered. I left you a month ago, Thomas said. You just didn't notice until now. He opened the car door and slid into the back seat. The heavy door thudded shut, sealing him inside the warm, leather-scented interior. The car pulled away, merging into the traffic of the rainy street. Laura stood alone on the curb. The exhaust fumes drifted over her, dissipating into the mist. She looked down at her silver dress, ruined by the mud and the rain, and realized she had no one to call to pick her up. Underscore. "6 months later. The house sat on a bluff overlooking Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, about 2 hours north of the Chicago noise. It was not a mansion of marble and steel. It was a structure of cedar, stone, and glass that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. It was the house Thomas had drawn on napkins 10 years ago, the house Laura had once called a cabin for hermits. Now it was real. Thomas knelt before the massive stone fireplace in the living room. The October air outside was crisp, smelling of fallen leaves and wood smoke, but inside, the radiant heat from the floors kept the space warm. He held a small cardboard box in his hands. It was the only box he hadn't unpacked. Inside were the artifacts of a dead marriage. A wedding photo in a cracked frame. A jagged, dried corsage from a homecoming dance a lifetime ago. And a stack of blueprints for a nursery addition to a condo in Chicago. An addition that never happened. He heard footsteps on the wide plank oak floor behind him. They were soft, bare feet. Do you need help with that? Sarah asked. Thomas looked up. Sarah was wearing one of his flannel shirts over her pajamas, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She didn't look like a model or a PR director. She looked like a woman who was comfortable in her own skin. No, Thomas said, taking the coffee she offered. Just clearing out the last of the debris. He didn't feel anger anymore. The rage that had fueled him in the workshop, the cold determination that had driven him to build the Aurora line. It had all burned off, leaving something cleaner and quieter behind. He felt light. He took the blueprints. He didn't crumble them. He simply placed them on the iron grate. He struck a match. The flame flared blue and yellow, catching the edge of the paper. Thomas watched the lines of ink curl and blacken. He watched the nursery label disappear into ash. It was a funeral for a future that wasn't meant to be. Are you okay? Sarah asked softly, sitting on the rug beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yeah," Thomas said, wrapping an arm around her. The fire cracked and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. "I am. It's finally finished." 100 miles south, in the heart of downtown Chicago, the wind howled against the 64th floor of the Elysium Tower. Laura sat on her beige sectional sofa. The apartment was pristine. The clean slate she had posted about on Instagram was maintained with military precision. There was no clutter. There were no dirty boots. There were no tools. There was also no sound. She was scrolling on her iPad. She shouldn't have been doing it. She had promised her therapist she would stop, but the impulse was an addiction she couldn't break. She was looking at the Architectural Digest website. The feature article was titled, "Sanctuary, Inside Thomas Wright's Lakeside Masterpiece." The photos were breathtaking. There was the living room with the stone fireplace. There was the workshop he had built in the barn. And there was a candid shot of Thomas and a woman, Sarah, sitting on the dock, their feet dangling in the water, laughing at something the photographer hadn't captured. Laura zoomed in on Thomas's face. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but the tension that used to define his jawline was gone. He looked peaceful. She looked at Sarah. She wasn't wearing makeup. She looked happy. Laura minimized the browser. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city. It was a Friday night. Her phone was silent. James had moved to New York 3 months ago after his company failed to IPO. He hadn't said goodbye, just sent a generic email to the staff. She was the director of PR. She had the title. She had the salary. She had the view. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging the surface. She traced a line through the condensation with her finger. She had spent 5 years waiting for Thomas to become someone worth her time. She had traded him for a chance at the high life, convinced that value was something you could calculate on a balance sheet. Now, looking down at the grid of lights that felt millions of miles away, she realized the cruelest truth of all. Thomas was the one who had been building a life. She had just been renting space in it. And now, her lease was up. Laura turned away from the window, back to the empty, perfect, silent room. She turned off the lamp, plunging the apartment into darkness, and sat there in the expensive quiet, waiting for a morning that would feel exactly like today.